Society International. I am Vivek Sinha, one of the General Secretaries of FISI, welcoming you to this great conference on one of the very important questions on a struggle to free Hindu temples from government control. The Friends of India Society International has conducted seminars, workshops, and presentations by distinguished persons on matters of India and the world at large. Friends of India Society International plans to educate the Friends of India all over the world in support of India causes and the world togetherness. In this series, we have a very dynamic presentation on a very good topic by Sri Sai Deepak Ji. The topic is recent Madras High Court judgment on Tamil Nadu temples preservation and its national importance. As we start the program, please mute yourself throughout as well as during the Q&A. At this time, I have a pleasure to present to you our esteemed leader, the International President of Friends of India Society, Dr. Bhishma Agnihotri. Dr. Agnihotri has a long list of accomplishments and credentials to his credit. He was the youngest person to be selected on a competitive basis as a judge in India. He served as the first person of India origin to head an American law school and was dean and chancellor for the longest tenure in American law school. Dr. Agnihotri was appointed as the first ambassador at large by the government of India in 2001. He traveled the world in strengthening the ties of NRIs from all backgrounds, gender, and religion to our motherland, India. Without further ado, I invite Dr. Agnihotri.
Welcome to all of you. It's our honor that we have amongst us a very distinguished person, Sai Deepak Ji. He has been a very distinguished lawyer. We call them attorneys in America. And after going through his resume and look into the cases he has looked into, worked with, I think he must be a tremendous person, working day and night because it's a tough thing to do. And also he has been involved in social activities of all kind. He had his own commitment for the good causes for the nation as well as for his clients. So his short resume has been given to all of you, and you may review it properly. You must have reviewed it. Please look into this more closely. And I'm looking forward for his presentation on the case. You just asked me whether I read the case or not. This is a 225-page judgment, decision, whatever. It's not judgment, it's decision. Now, or pronouncements, I would say. But I have not read it wholly, but I have read part of it. I was very much impressed by the approach the court has taken. It looked like sun has started shining in some parts of the world. It was not shining before. Anyway, before I talk further about this topic, let me talk to you about somebody else who has now come, and I need to mention his name because his name is very relevant for our topic. And he is our good friend, our friend of everybody, friend of our community, friend of our various things. He's always there with news. You know, this decision was made on June the 9th, 2021, and to my understanding. And on June the 14th, 2021, this person, who is a revolutionary person in his own way, his name is what? You guess it. See, Damle ji. Shri Damnaji, who is here, Sridharji, he was there. He has sent the information to everybody, almost in the world. Everybody knew what it was, information was, and what kind of impact it would have. I requested him to give me more information. In fact, suggested to him that if he could prepare, maybe he should make a presentation to this group. But he is very shy in his own way. He's very modest. So he said, no, we should get somebody else to do it. So I wanted to say this, that we are here because of him, because he introduced us to this topic. And in few days, we were able to get somebody like Deepak Ji, who has done so much work in this field and other fields also, which I don't want to get into at this time. But anyway, Sattar, you also helped us a lot to get him here. So without talking too much about people, our people who have been helping us, who are our colleagues, who are friends, who are our co-workers. So I would now request our distinguished speaker to start what we want to hear from him. Thank you.
So I assume it's the evening for the viewers and the listeners from the United
Yes.
States. So good evening to everyone. I hope I'm visible and audible. I'll try and keep this as crisp as possible so that we have sufficient time for questions. This judgment, which was delivered on the 7th of June 2021 by a division bench of the Madras High Court, is obviously a landmark judgment in its own way. So let me first of all break down for the listeners what the judgment is about and what it is certainly not. Point number one, the judgment has been delivered primarily in the context of multiple writ petitions, which were filed by several public-spirited citizens seeking constitution of a committee to administer a specific zone, which is the Mamallapuram heritage area, which basically has a lot of heritage structures. And this is in the outskirts of Chennai, about 150 to maybe 200 kilometers away from Chennai. And it is in the context of this particular area, so to speak, that the petitions were heard by the court, because a committee was supposed to be set up by the state government of Tamil Nadu a couple of years ago. But since the committee did not come into existence even after 4 to 5 years of the issue being raked up, a couple of writ petitions were filed before the Madras High Court, asking the court to intervene and look into the matter so that necessary directions could be passed to the state government and expedite the process of constitution of this committee. That is the primary context in which this particular judgment has been delivered. So therefore, I wouldn't extrapolate the value of this particular judgment beyond this particular issue to the question of state control of temples or freedom from state control, because that's an issue that the court has not had an opportunity to address in this particular case. However, what the court has certainly done is that it has taken a panoramic view of the condition of temples and its associated properties, as well as the upkeep and maintenance of temples, including issues such as renovation and whatnot, and has passed a host of directions under multiple heads. So while the judgment runs into about 224 pages, the better part of it captures the history of the temples of Tamil Nadu, its cultural significance, and the fact that several thousands of these temples constitute heritage sites within the meaning of several international charters, including United Nations charters. So those are aspects which are not matters of contestation, which are not matters of law, so to speak, from the standpoint of any interpretation that the court has had to arrive at with a lot of trouble. In fact, a reading of the judgment very clearly shows that this judgment is not about the interpretation of any particular area of law, nor does it shine light specifically on aspects which have a long-term bearing on the ability of the state to interfere with functioning of temples and the manner in which it goes about appointing state appointees for the purposes of administration. Although it touches upon those aspects, it doesn't go deep into these issues. As I said, the reason why the court could not have gone deep into each of these issues is because the context is very limited and very specific. which is the constitution of a committee for the purposes of administration of a certain heritage site, which should have taken place at least 4 or 5 years ago. So with this in mind, I would request members of the audience to have very reasonable and tempered expectations as to what to expect from this particular judgment. So that's point number one. Point number two, what the court has certainly had an opportunity to actually consider, and which I would say is the central thrust of the judgment and the nub of the judgment, is the sheer inadequacy and the criminal incompetence of the HRC administration and the HRC, let's say, bureaucratic setup, so to speak, in the manner in which they administer temples. And HRC, for those who are not aware of it, would be the Hindu Religious Charitable Endowment Department, which is a statutory department which is constituted across 15 states under state legislations. So the Tamil Nadu legislation, which is currently in force, is the Hindu Religious and Charitable Endowment Act of 1959, which is of course currently under challenge before the Supreme Court. But since the legislation continues to be in force until it is struck down by the Supreme Court, the department which has been constituted under that particular legislation continues to take charge of temples and administer them. The court records very clearly that out of 42,000 temples in the state of Tamil Nadu, over 38,000 temples are under the control of the HRC, and most of them happen to be temples of heritage value, which date back to at least 1500 to 2000 years. So these are certain aspects that the court specifically records. And the reason why this is important is that typically under the circumstances and the kind of atmosphere that we live in India, we don't expect constitutional courts to take cognizance of the antiquity of these temples and the fact that most of them have a pre-Muslim, pre-Christian origin, and the kind of culture that they continue to carry and continue to take forward clearly represent the culture of this particular land, the indigenous culture of this land. These are certain stellar findings of this particular judgment, which gives me hope that there are still courts in this country which are willing to recognize the roots of this particular land and the origins of those roots and which particular faith system or which particular ontology, epistemology, and theology they subscribe to. These are aspects that this particular judgment delves into and deals with extensively. At the very least, about 60 to 70 pages of this particular judgment are dedicated to the discussion of the significance of temples, the role played by temples historically, which goes beyond the religious role from the standpoint of, let's say, supporting artisans, artists, and several communities. So the fact that the temple happens to be a civilizational nerve center, which is meant to encourage and give empower as well as give livelihood to a host of communities and not just one particular caste or one particular group, is something that the judgment captures with scintillating clarity and with reference to history. Second, the court also takes a look at the entire statutory mechanism and asks itself whether the HRC department has done at least a decent job of discharging its duties with respect to protection of these temples, protection of the properties of the temple, let's say removal of encroachers from the properties of temple, preservation of idols or retrieval of stolen idols, vigrahas and murtis as we may call it, as opposed to idols. So these are aspects that the court discusses in detail. In addition to that, the court also asks itself whether the HRC department has the right to interfere with religious aspects, including with respect to appointment of priests and appointment of trustees. These are aspects that the court deals with under several baskets and several heads, which is why, independent of the question of whether the state should be controlling temples, as long as the state controls these temples and these temples happen to be under the umbrella of the state, how is the state supposed to conduct itself, which is consistent with the legislative intent, is the issue that the court deals with. And as Dr. Agnihotri rightly pointed out, this is not a final judgment simply because certain directions have been issued and the state has been given a period of about 12 weeks to comply with these directions. And some of these directions happen to be far-reaching because the court takes cognizance of the fact that a lot of these temples suffer from poor upkeep and maintenance, primarily because the state has not put in place educational apparatus to train future sthapatis or sculptors or even engineers, and the kind of specialists, subject matter specialists that one needs to ensure that these temples are not just preserved, but are also renovated in a manner which is consistent with their unique styles, architectural styles. So, from a standpoint of archaeology, epigraphy, and whatnot, the code deals with these aspects. And certain living legends of Indian archaeology, such as Dr. R. Nagaswamy, have been quoted in extenso, including their submissions and recommendations. So, for a refreshing change, this is a judgment that respects the position that the Hindu society has traditionally accorded to temples, takes that in the right spirit, also deals with the importance of Agama Shastras in the manner in which temples are either constructed or renovated, gets into the question of whether the state can appoint its own appointees who do not have any faith either in Hindu deities or in Hindu practices. In fact, there are certain stellar observations where the court goes on to very clearly say that any person who's appointed to even perhaps an administrative post in the temple administration must necessarily be a theist and must be someone who respects Hindu sentiments and the unique practices of each temple, because it's not sufficient for you to be a Hindu. You should also have faith, or at the very least respect the unique traditions and the unique, let's say, sectarian outlook of each temple. So for instance, if it happens to be a Shaivite temple, and the person who's appointed to that particular post or administrative post in that particular temple has no faith in Shaivism, notwithstanding the fact that he may be a devout Hindu or a practicing Hindu, then he does not do justice to the post that he's been appointed to and the duties that he's expected to discharge as part of that particular post or designation. It is to this level of granularity and this level of detail that this judgment has gone into, which is what makes this judgment, according to me, a welcome relief. Because assuming for a moment that the constitutional challenge to the HRC legislation, which is pending before the Supreme Court, does not succeed, or if the outcome is not as ideal as we would want it to be, I would certainly draw heart from the fact that this judgment tries to make the best of a shoddy piece of legislation or a malicious piece of legislation and tries to give as many rights as possible to Hindus and Hindu believers, so to speak, with respect to their own places of worship. The court specifically records that the HRC legislation is meant to ensure that the state respects the rights of believers, specifically temple-going Hindus. And therefore, if the state fails to perform its duties, it is as good as either failing the citizens and, most importantly, infringing the rights of the devout, because this legislation is seen as a social contract between the people and the state. So if the people have been comfortable enough to give the state this kind of a space in their religious and civilizational spaces, so to speak, then the state is equally expected to step up and perform its end of the obligation by discharging its role in the most transparent manner possible, and also in a manner which is consistent with Hindu beliefs. So these are certain aspects that the court has gone into. Let me just walk the members of the audience through a couple of portions of the judgment, especially the portions that deal with the directions that the court has passed under different heads, so that you understand the full play of this particular judgment and the kind of issues that it has dealt with. Because it's 224 pages, not every part of the judgment is something that everybody has to go through. I would simply start from page number 198. The last 30 pages is where the directions of the court have been captured. So one set of directions have been specifically passed with respect to the constitution of the Heritage Committee that I mentioned a few minutes ago, with respect to the Mahabalipuram Amalapuram area. So that is the first aspect that the court deals with, because that happens to be the primary reason or the trigger behind these petitions being filed before the court. Second is the constitution of expert committees, both at the state level and then at district level, so that every district has access to experts, from structural experts to archaeological experts to conservation experts to traditional sthapatis, apart from educational institutions which have the necessary infrastructure as well as the human resource to cater to the requirements of each of these districts. That's the second thing that the court addresses. The third subhead, so to speak, that the court addresses is the question of preservation of monuments and what constitutes an antique monument or a heritage site within the meaning of Indian law. That is, anything that is more than 100 years old, it is necessarily an antique temple or a antique monument, so to speak. So therefore, the court comes to the conclusion that applying this logic and applying this particular position to temples across the state of Tamil Nadu, perhaps 90% of the temples would fall within the definition of a heritage site. So this is, and therefore, what kind of obligations are cast on the Archaeological Survey of India, coupled with the HRC department, in order for them to ensure that these heritage sites are treated as heritage sites in accordance with the law. That's the third issue that the court considers. The fourth issue that the court goes into is a question of periodic inspection, because as most people are aware, that temple idol theft is something that's extremely common, and most of these murtis effectively find their way to some museum in some part of the world, or to some private collection, or to some underground basement where we never know where these idols ultimately go. So the court specifically takes cognizance of this. What is interesting is, out of the two judges who are part of this bench, Justice Mahadevan, who happens to be the senior judge of this particular bench, is the judge who passed a previous landmark judgment which deals with the question of idol theft in the state of Tamil Nadu, where he castigated the HRC department and several officials of the HRC department for being hand in glove with thieves of temple architecture and temple antiquities. So anyone who's interested in charting a pattern or in understanding the evolution of this temple jurisprudence in the Madras High Court, I would request them to pull out the judgments of Justice Mahadevan. And I've had the privilege of arguing before him with respect to temple theft matters on a pro bono basis a couple of months ago. In fact, not a couple of months ago, perhaps a year ago, just before the lockdown hit. So this particular judgment is consistent with Justice Mahadevan's position in a previous judgment. That judgment was delivered, I think, in July 2018 or 19. I'll have the link shared with the organizers of this particular session so that members can read that judgment as well, and they can see a common pattern emerging between those two, that judgment and this one. In fact, in that judgment, Justice Mahadevan categorically says that the state has a fundamental duty and there is a corresponding fundamental right on the part of Hindus when it comes to preservation of their idols and preservation of their places of worship. Given the atmospherics and the kind of, politics that Bharat has usually been witness to, I found that particular judgment a revolutionary judgment, because a constitutional duty was being cast on the state when it comes to preservation of our architecture and our heritage. This is something that usually one doesn't get to hear when it comes to Indian courts and Hindu issues. So therefore, this was a path-breaking judgment according to me. And therefore, I'm not surprised that such a judgment has come from a bench which has Justice Mahadevan. Let's hope that Justice Mahadevan lives a long life and continues to serve Dharma in the best possible way. The fourth head, which the court has addressed under this particular judgment as part of its directions, is the question of how does one undertake repairs, alteration, and renovation works with respect to heritage monuments. What kind of expertise is called for? What kind of due diligence is called for? What kind of ecosystem is the state government supposed to set up in order for it to have access to a pool of trained people who can address these issues on a regular basis as well as a long-term basis? Because obviously, in most countries, perhaps even in the most advanced of jurisdictions, whether it's Switzerland or United States or whichever country it may be, the state is not exactly the most efficient of entities. Therefore, it needs to have access to a private set of players and private talent in order for it to be able to tap into the talent and discharge its public duty. So how does one go about setting it up, and what kind of mechanisms and what kind of ecosystem the state government and the HRC department must have access to? That is something that this bench deals with in extenso. And there are specific directions to the state government to constitute educational institutions and training institutes so that the ASI as well as the HRC department have access to people who are qualified to assist them when it comes to renovation, maintenance, and stuff like that. Then there's a critical aspect of the judgment which deals with the question of utilization of temple funds, wherein the court is very, very clear that temple funds must be used exclusively for the purposes of temples and not for any other kind of secular politics, where Hindu money is used for appeasing certain other communities or for their benefit. The court is also clear that any surplus surplus funds which these institutions generate, or which may be with the HRC department, because as most people are aware, the HRC department gets an 16 to 18% cut, a tax of sorts, from the so-called incompetent, inefficient service that it performs in the context of Hindu temples. So therefore, the court says that any surplus funds that may be with the HRC department out of its collections must also be plowed back and used for the purposes of these temples, their renovations, as well as for communities that are dependent on these temples. Because obviously, it's not just a question of the structure, it's not just a question of service, it's also a question of employment. There are any number of communities that are dependent for their survival on the existence of a temple ecosystem. So how these funds are meant to be used for the benefit of those ecosystems and those communities is something that the court very sensitively and beautifully touches upon. Then, of course, you have certain directions which have been given with respect to audit procedures. Because you see, here's the funny part. What happens under the HRC Act, I'm just giving a broad idea without getting into the technicalities of it, is that a temple is taken over by the HRC department if it believes that the temple's finances have been mismanaged. Now, the funny part is, this entity which undertakes the audit itself is the beneficiary of that particular activity at the end of the day, because not only does it get to take over that particular temple and manage it and use its resources, it also gets about 18% cut for the service it performs. Therefore, an entity with a manifest self-interest or a conflict of interest is the entity that is undertaking an audit. Therefore, one of the things that we have been asking for in multiple litigations is that before the state chooses to take over a certain temple, at the very least, the act of audit must be undertaken by an independent organization as opposed to the state government itself. Because obviously the state government would be more than happy to take over a particular institution, whether or not there is actually a case made out for takeover, whether or not there is actually a case made out for mismanagement. Therefore, what we have been asking for is audit procedures must at the very least come across as fair and transparent, wherein an entity which has a manifest interest in taking over an institution doesn't create a facade of mismanagement merely to take over that particular institution. So on this aspect, the court has laid down a few directions with respect to how the audit procedures must be undertaken and how stakeholders of a certain temple have the right to participate in that audit, as well as raise objections when the state government commits a mistake with respect to audit. So that's the other heading. Then another aspect which is rarely discussed, because most governments in Bharat effectively engage in secular politics, which is anti-Hindu politics, is the recovery of land revenue, rent, arrears, and encroachments. So whenever we discuss the question of temples, we have to understand that apart from the property on which the temple itself is located, in 9 out of 10 cases, the surrounding property also belongs to the temple, because most of those real estate and most of the real estate would have been endowed to the temple by devotees in the past or even in the present. Now, those properties are the ones on which you have a lot of shops and other establishments which are established to serve the devotees who come to that particular temple. But over and above that, what happens is, one, revenues such as rent are not properly collected from those establishments by the HRC department, which takes over the temple. Two, gradually, those prime pieces of real estate are used for purposes which have got nothing to do with temples. So for instance, in quite a few places now, we have beef shops and mutton shops and chicken shops emerging right in front of temples. That's the kind of activity which is not to be undertaken, at least in front of most temples, unless it happens to be a temple where this can be offered as prasad or whatever it may be. So therefore, the reason why the property of the real estate surrounding the temple is meant to belong to the temple is to ensure that the vicinity of the temple at least is meant to be kept in a certain way or maintained in a way which is consistent with the practices of the temple. Three, what happens over a point is people start building establishments and they start building residential complexes, and slowly, in the name of regularization, the land which belongs to the temple and which is encroached by people who have absolutely no business being in that particular place, is regularized by state governments with the active cooperation of the HRC department, without the Hindu community having so much as a say in terms of the regularization or having the ability to object to the regularization. This happens on a regular basis. In fact, I don't know how many people are aware of this famous temple in Chennai, which is the Mayalapur Kapalishwara temple. Several schools and several gyms and other establishments have been established in the vicinity of this particular temple, without the temple having had the remotest of says in anybody having access to this particular land. And this is prime piece of real estate, the revenue from which can be used to establish orphanages, hospitals, and educating Hindu children, not other children, specifically and only Hindu children. I don't see the point in using Hindu resources to educate other people. So therefore, these are certain issues which the court has actually tried to deal with and streamline as much as possible. Then the last two heads under which is, of course, the idol theft aspect, which the court considers, because here's the kind of racket that happens in the name of preserving idols from theft. Strong rooms are created by the state government in the form of vaults to preserve those artifacts and antiquities which they believe are valuable and which could effectively find their way into the black market. But once the antiquities land in the strong room, rest assured the chances of them being stolen and being replaced are higher than being in the temple. They are safer in temples and protected by devotees than actually landing in the so-called strong rooms of the state government. Because the track record of the state government, especially the police department, has been that there is typically someone from the police department, and usually not someone from the Hindu community, who's hand in glove with temple thieves. And that's how you have all these idols ultimately finding their way to Middle East and God knows where else. So on this particular issue, there are some directions that have been passed by the court. And then finally, you have the discussion on the payment of salaries and appointment of people at various levels within the temple ecosystem, from musicians to the priests to other temple staff, the administrative staff. And on this issue, the court is very, very clear that there can be no interference by the HRC department with the performance of day-to-day regulations, day-to-day religious activities. One thing that I would like to point out is it's not just performance of religious duties on a regular basis. In major temples, I'll give perhaps a non-Tamil Nadu example. We can perhaps consider the Jagannath Puri temple as one of the examples. About 36 mutts or mathas, so to speak, are responsible for jointly running the various operations that fall within the ambit of running the Jagannath Puri temple. Over the years, extensive bureaucratization of the administration of the Jagannath Puri temple has come to a point and has led to a situation where over 50% of the activities, religious activities which are supposed to be undertaken, not just in the main temple, but also all the temples and mathas which are associated with the Puri temple itself, have been stopped because the Babus suddenly tell us that there is no money for it and that there is no resource to provide for it. So here's a situation where if this administration were to be left to the devotees, they would somehow find the resources to continue performing those activities. But it's the bureaucrat who ultimately tells us that a certain religious activity cannot be performed owing to paucity of resources. And you are not even in a position to ask him, how do you account for the paucity of resources when this has been happening for millennia and for generations together? A similar situation one can find in some major temples of Tamil Nadu, for instance, in Madurai Meenakshi and all the other temples as well, where a significant number of religious activities and rituals have been stopped primarily because of lack of access to resources. So forget keeping the ones which are already, keeping the existing rites and rituals alive. We are slowly looking at a situation where the lack of a resource is going to be cited as an excuse for non-performance of some of these rituals. And as someone who strongly believes in the sanctity of these rituals, not just because the devotees believe in it, but the fundamental belief is that each of these activities preserves not just the sanctity of that particular place, but also is responsible for the energy balance which the presence of that particular idol or the vigraham is responsible for. So cessation of a religious activity in the context of a temple, according to me, is not just a question of infraction of religious rights. According to me, it has serious direct consequences. And as a believer, I certainly believe in it. I don't see the point in putting faith in a temple without actually putting stock in each of these, let's say, beliefs, so to speak. So that's one. Then, of course, the court has discussed the issue of creation of an institute for sthapatis because the quality of sthapatis has fallen down. But this issue, I don't think the court has addressed in a sufficient manner, and there's a good reason for this. Sthapatis or sculptors have been typically, it's been a traditional vocation, it's been a hereditary vocation. And there are specific communities such as the Vishwakarma communities, which are actually meant to undertake this particular activity. They are as well versed in the Vedas as most people who are supposed to be, because whatever they do is practically Veda in action. Second, they are meant to be dvijas, in which case they are also supposed to wear the janevu. That's something that most people are not aware of. Three, like most other Hindu practices or vocations, it passes on from the father to the son. Now, what certain state governments have done and successive state governments have done is that a profession which is effectively the product of the father passing on his knowledge to the son and the son being an apprentice to the father until the father's passing have been reduced to 2-year and 6-month certification courses. So anybody and everybody can become a sthapati, whether or not they have any belief in the kind of way of life that you're supposed to observe once you take up this particular profession, from dietary habits to different kinds of anushtans that you're supposed to perform. Now it's been reduced to 6 months and 1 year and whatnot. So it's like a training course. So a skill has become, according to me, or a skill or a craft has just become just another job. And I'm not averse to people from other faiths becoming sthapatis, so long as they put faith in this particular practice. And by default, they have to become Hindus if they want to be sthapatis. There is no other option. They are Hindus in practice if they become sthapati. They have no other option for this. But none of that is required under these so-called certification and training courses. You don't have to be someone who has faith in Hinduism. You don't have to be someone who has any faith in any of these practices for you to practice what is effectively a religious vocation. So that is, according to me, the utilitarian thinking at play, where every craft and every profession is reduced to just another money-earning activity. And this has happened not in any other place, but it has happened within temples. Unfortunately, on this particular aspect, the court's judgment leaves a lot to be desired because these aspects have not been addressed. It limits its discussion on this particular issue only to one direction, which is paragraph 50. And this is on page number 214. Then, of course, it goes into salaries, benefits, superannuations, transfers, and all these things. So all in all, I would say it's not a bad judgment. And since this is still work in progress and a certain period of time has been given to the state government to act on each of these directions, there is still some hope that some of these aspects can be addressed as it goes along. I was not personally associated with this particular matter because I've been occupied with my own commitments and practice commitments. But I believe that the ones who've been associated with this matter have done a fantastic job of pursuing this matter to its logical conclusion. And I would say at this stage, it's an intermediary conclusion because there's still a lot more to be done under the same judgment. So the first thing that I certainly want to dispel in terms of any myths that people may have about this judgment is that it does nothing on the question of freedom from state control. It's got nothing to do with that particular issue at all whatsoever. Okay. It limits itself primarily to the question of administration under the structure, under the legal structure as it exists, and tries to streamline that as much as possible, and rightly holds the HRC department responsible for all the inefficiency and incompetence that this entire ecosystem is rife with. So to that extent, it's a fantastic recognition and acknowledgement of the grievances of Hindu devotees with respect to the HRC department's functioning. Let's see what happens and how far we are able to get things done on the ground on the basis of this particular judgment. And the larger question is whether this judgment has any value in other states outside of Tamil Nadu. Now, frankly speaking, that's a function and that's a question of the legislative structure or the legal structure in each of the states. By and large, they may be the same, but I'm certainly confident that the fundamental principles and the spirit of this judgment can be extrapolated and applied to other states as well. So to that extent, I think it's a fantastic shot in the arm for anyone who wants to knock the doors of other high courts with respect to other states, so that they can try and pin the blame on the HRC departments in those states and try to get them to do their act together. Let's see how that works. But Tamil Nadu, I think, at least people of Tamil Nadu and people who have immense respect and who value the temple ecosystem of Tamil Nadu can certainly draw heart from the fact that here's a judgment that does not beat around the bush on the identity of the land, on the importance of temples to the identity of the land, and the need to keep each of these traditions and structures alive, because the court starts the entire judgment with a clear acknowledgement that temples and such institutions are not meant merely for the present, but they're typically institutions meant for posterity, and they're supposed to be handed to the next generation. And therefore, we must do whatever we can to ensure that these institutions survive in the best possible manner, so that the next generation can learn about their past from each of these institutions. So to that extent, I think it's a stellar judgment. This would be, according to me, a reasonable expectation from the judgment, as opposed to extrapolating it for everything under the sun. This is all the judgment effectively stands for, nothing beyond this. So questions are welcome. I can take questions for about 15 to 20 minutes. So please go on, shoot.
Thank you, Sandeep. I think each point what you narrated and so eloquently and clearly, it really raises so many questions. And it reminded me actually one of the incidents you talking about, the audits of HRC, go back to the British Raj, or British government, when they used to take over the small estates by simply a king does not have their heir, the son, and they just used to take the one by one. So it seems like it's a British colonization techniques are being used in the temples, and each point actually requires a whole movement to be able to have the fruitful effect, or to be really able to help the Hindu society in terms. At this point, I think we have some questions. So if you could please ask your question.
Yeah, this is Satya. Sai, I should appreciate the beautiful work you have done. I mean, you presented it so well. I think we need more people like you to do this work full time. But my question is this. In the past, there have been judgments as well. And how did those judgments been really made a change on the ground compared to what do you expect your real change in the ground based on this judgment? In the end, that is what matters, right? What happens in the...
Right. So I'll connect the compliment you gave me and to the question you just asked me, which is that I think I'm a naive idiot who's working on this issue, because frankly speaking, it needs more people. It needs more active people stepping into this particular issue. I don't see the point in being a lone warrior. And fortunately, I'm not a lone warrior. There are enough people who are doing this, and I'm a relatively late entrant to this particular issue. The sense of commitment that youngsters of other communities have towards their institutions is something that is fundamentally lacking in our community. So if you really want to see the fruits of these judgments, it is for the people to use this judgment as a weapon and wave it in the faces of HRC departments for you to actually see the fruits of it and the dividends of it. Because the court has done its job. Now it's up to the devotees for them to take this judgment forward and do whatever they can to milk it for whatever it's worth. And that's not the job of the lawyers alone. I think it's primarily on the shoulders of the community for them to take an interest. Because you see, as long as the courts do nothing, we have a fantastic gripe. Oh, our courts are anti-Hindu. Oh, the constitution is anti-Hindu. Oh, everything is anti-Hindu. So we keep crying over and over about that. But now that a court has actually given you a judgment which you can use in your favor and which is specifically meant to address your institutions and the institutional issues that you have with the HRC department, how does the community come together? First of all, I think it's a question of awareness. So the passing of this particular judgment, its actual implications, without glorifying it, its actual implications must be conveyed. And how many people who visit these temples whenever they come from the United States or people who live here, how many people actually form action groups to pursue this? Because I'm sure a lot of people come to India for Tirth Yatra from California. I'd like to understand what is it that they're willing to do to protect these temples. So these are issues that the community has to ask itself. Because at the end of the day, lawyers can do only so much and courts can do only so much. Everything ultimately boils down to the street veto that you have, where you're in a position to hold the HRC department by the scruff of its collar and ask it certain uncomfortable questions, especially when you have a fantastic judgment in your favor. So I would believe that now the ball is not in the court's court, but in the community's court. Okay. So let's see what is it that the Hindu community is capable of once given this kind of a judgment. So right back at you, this question goes back to the community.
Sai, I have a question. Rama here. So my question is that what stands between the implementation of this judgment in the ground right now in Tamil Nadu at least? Generally, we have these judgments that get passed and then it takes so much time to get on the ground hitting, right? And how is it that we can really help? Given that the one thing that I totally liked is that it goes back to the community, people who believe in the practice, like Vaishnavite takes care of a Vaishnavite temple and a Shaivite takes care of a Shaivite temple. Because if you put me into a Shaivite temple, I may not know the actual practice, even though I am 100% practicing Hindu. So all that is absolutely welcome. But what is it that stands between the implementation on the ground? And how can we help from here?
So the good part about the judgment, which should help answer your question perhaps to a degree of about 30%, is that this judgment was not passed in the face of opposition from the state government. Okay, in the sense it has not seen the kind of contestation that I would have expected from the state government. Imagine the court calling the HRC department a bunch of thieves in politically correct language. Okay, and still the HRC department not putting up too much of a fight, because by now it has become public knowledge that the department is not exactly covered in glory. Okay, so according to me, this judgment is a standing testament to a public acknowledgement by the department itself of all the chinks in its armor. Now, second, notwithstanding the fact that the current dispensation of the state of Tamil Nadu may subscribe to a specific ideology, from whatever I have seen so far, the HRC minister is someone who has been actively touring temples. Mr. Shekhar Babu has been actively touring temples and has been helping a lot of archakas during the COVID. Okay. So I would keep an open mind, of course, a certain degree of vigilance, of course. At the same time, I would keep an open mind. And those people who have, let's say, so there are enough Vaishnavite organizations, there are enough Shaivite organizations. Whether or not it's a Shaivite organization or a Vaishnavite organization, I would simply ask myself a simple question. It would be very, very difficult to break this issue into multiple splinter groups. I don't think it works that way. Each person, I mean, each community which is in charge of a particular temple can certainly take an interest. That would be the ideal situation. But the major mathas across the state and the major institutions across the state must first read this particular judgment. And I would certainly think of one or two workshops where it translates to deliverables, actual deliverables using this particular judgment. And if the mathas decide to appoint lawyers and teams through their own followers, so to speak, I think it's easier to do it. See, public property is nobody's property is the standard rule in India. Similarly, if it belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one. That's the simple thing. Okay. So if some institution has to take ownership of this particular cause and has to embrace it, then I would immediately go to those institutions which have a significant amount of following. I don't speak of the New Age gurus. I specifically refer to the Sampradayik gurus. I'm referring only to institutions which have a tradition and which have a very clear established tradition. You have a lot of adhinams across Tamil Nadu. Each of these institutions assume for a moment that an Adhinam's land were to be occupied by an encroacher. They would certainly fall back on professional expertise to get that land back. Now, I am saying go a step further. Whether this belongs to you or not, ultimately it's a question of protecting real estate that belongs to the community, because real estate translates to visibility, it translates to presence, and as long as you're present, you can't be ignored. That is the big picture realization that I think each of these institutions must have. So if they can come together, the major Adhinams, if they can come together, pool their resources and pursue this particular judgment on a regular basis, and they have a periodic review, and they keep approaching the court in case of non-compliance with the state government, because you have to remember, any amount of time that's given to the state government, they'll constantly ask for extensions. So somebody must doggedly go back to the court and say, this was the time given to them. They have not done this. What is the status affidavit of the update that they have filed before the court to show that these are the steps that they have taken to comply with the directions of the court? This is something that is a painstaking work. And professional litigators like me who are sitting in Delhi can do precious little when it comes to Tamil Nadu and other places. We can do only so much. There's obviously the question of tyranny of distance. So it's important that local councils, local lawyers are empowered, and the community must put its money where its mouth is. Please don't expect people to work free of charge simply because this happens to be for dharma. Everything is dharma. We don't seem to be working free everywhere. So I don't think that's how this is supposed to work. How do you think other communities get their job done? They literally throw money. So go about this professionally. Make sure that you have pooled in the resources to get the best of talent to do the best of representation for you before this forum. Here's a forum that is willing to listen to you. So why don't you send people now to pursue this on a regular basis? These are the broad suggestions that I can give, and these are fairly workable. Because after 12 weeks, assume for a moment that the state government does not do what is expected of it, which it won't. You must have someone file a contempt petition in the High Court saying this was the time given to them. They have not asked you for an extension. We don't know what is the status. They certainly don't seem to have complied with it. Multiple contempt petitions would effectively mean completely messing up the track record of the HRC department before the court's eyes, and therefore putting them in a corner and ensuring that this department learns the lesson that it ought to have long ago. This is a fantastic opportunity. So these are a couple of things that you can certainly consider doing. However, the other thing that you can certainly do is, even if you're not in a position to protect all the 38,000 temples which are under the HRC department, you have very clear major temples in several places, right? So at the very least, can the community think of constituting a task force of sorts which addresses these specific big temples? In fact, the judgment has done something wonderful, which is it has highlighted the major temples which are the subject of its, let's say, discussion. It has identified each of those temples, from Rameshwaram to the Meenakshi temple to Tirunamalai. Each of those temples have been identified. So at the very least, if you're in a position to do something with respect to these major sthalas and kshetras, I would assume that it would have some kind of a downward filtration effect which goes to other temples. Okay, that's something that you can certainly consider doing. Nothing stands in the way of implementation except for the community's will. There is nothing that stands in the way, according to me. If there's an institutional roadblock subsequently, then you always have the option of going back to the court and say, there are your directions. We don't see what is it that's stopping the government from implementing those directions.
True.
But someone has to continue goading and prodding the government, which is the community.
Sure. And thank you very much. I will definitely take this back to the Vaishnava Mats in Tamil Nadu.
How much time do you have now? How much time do you have, please? Deepak ji?
We have few minutes, but yeah. I think Aditya ji has one question. Maybe we can have him ask the question.
Can I have to speak for 2 minutes.
Sure.
Anybody else would want to come before? Let me say a few minutes, because I don't want to just go away with that. By the way, Deepak ji, I admire what you're doing. You did a very good job as a lawyer. Believe me, as I mentioned to you, I was a judge, I was a lawyer, and you analyzed it so well that though I didn't read the judgment, not judgment, whatever it was, the decision, now I understand the whole issue very well. Let me offer to you something. In a few days' time, let us let's get together, you and me, we talk on the telephone, and let us work on something if you can, and we can work out a strategy which you had suggested, especially for what will happen after 12 weeks or whatever happened thereafter. So let's talk about this thing, and you may have all the system in place, but I just want to be sure that I think you have a very clear idea of what the whole thing is all about. I'm very happy that you are here, and I had my own doubts too about it, to be honest. Satya knows it, but you came out great. You read the whole thing so well, so completely, that you could argue this case before any Supreme Court judge without any notes at your disposal. But anyway, all said and done, but believe me that let us stay in touch. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay? I know you're a busy man.
Sure.
I'm not that busy these days. So we can be talking about this thing, and I can help you in my own way to enlist some support for your activities. Okay? And I believe it. I
Sure,
always
sir.
trust it. The lawyers should not be given free of charge for anything. They should be paid well for the work. Otherwise, perhaps they won't. Sometimes they lose interest. They should not lose interest. Okay.
Sure,
I just
sir.
want to
Thank
say this because I may not have a chance to say it. Okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, Bhishmi. I'm not sure if Dr. Purohit is on the Zoom call right now.
Let me tell you what Dr. Purohit is our president of
Right.
the
So,
USA president. Okay.
right. So Dr. Purohit, it seems like he is not able to join us, but he's our national president, and on his behalf, I think I want.
Deepak ji, the one thing good about this guy is his brother is the governor of the state of
I
Tamil
see.
Nadu.
I see.
Rohit,
So maybe we can then say thank you to Deepak ji, and if there is no question at this point, and take some points of action actually, as Deepak ji is saying and Bhishmi is talking about. Maybe we need to talk not in the meeting in this setup, but in a one-on-one setup to see what kind of help we can provide. Because each of the point what you read out of this judgment is really a moment on its own, and how it needs to be taken to the different states so that the same judgment can be applied and it can turn into a movement. Then only the Hindu society, the Hindu temples can really be saved from all the disgrace which is happening by HRC community.
Sure.
So
Thank you for the opportunity
thank you very much again.
to
Pranam.
speak with your members. I hope I've done justice to it. Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you, Sai.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pranam ji.
Thank you very much.
Namaste.